Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The day was serene, with a golden sun casting warm light over Cypress Grove Cemetery. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the breeze rustled the autumn leaves, a gentle reminder of the cyclical nature of life. The gathered mourners stood in solemn clusters, their hushed conversations occasionally punctuated by a soft chuckle or sigh as they reminisced about Robert Henley, a man revered for his generosity and a life dedicated to serving the less fortunate. Robert's reputation was legendary in the small, tight-knit community. Known for his philanthropic efforts and endless kindness, he had touched countless lives, from funding community centers to organizing food drives. His polished black headstone bore the epitaph, "A life of service and sacrifice," a phrase that summed up how everyone perceived him. Among the mourners, a presence stood out, not for grandeur or ostentation, but for its quiet distinctiveness. An elderly black woman, draped in a modest deep green dress that shimmered faintly in the sunlight, stood apart from the rest. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, revealing a face lined not just with age, but with the kind of wisdom and experience that only a life of trials could bestow. No one seemed to recognize her. Whispers spread among the crowd. Who is she? Was she one of the beneficiaries of his charity? Maybe she's a distant relative? The questions lingered, but no one dared approach her. She stood with an air of quiet dignity, her eyes fixed on the casket as if she were engaged in a private conversation with the man lying within. As the service began, a pastor stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. He spoke eloquently about Robert's numerous achievements, the schools he had funded, the lives he had changed, the endless hours he had spent volunteering at shelters. Heads nodded in agreement, some faces wet with tears. It was the kind of eulogy that painted a man as near perfect, someone who had given everything for others without expecting anything in return. The elderly woman remained silent, her gaze steady but unyielding. When the pastor invited people to share their memories, she didn't move. One by one, others stepped forward, sharing stories of Robert's kindness. A single mother tearfully recounted how he had paid for her child's surgery. An elderly couple spoke of the time he had rebuilt their home after a devastating storm. Each story seemed to cement Robert's legacy as a saint-like figure. But something about the woman's demeanor suggested she had a different story to tell. As the service concluded and people began dispersing, the woman finally stepped forward. Her movement was deliberate, her presence commanding despite her fragile frame. Those who had ignored her earlier now turned to watch, curiosity etched on their faces. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'd like to say a few words about Robert Henley." The crowd, caught off guard, murmured in surprise. The pastor hesitated for a moment but then handed her the microphone. The woman stood there, the weight of decades reflected in her posture. She took a deep breath before beginning. "My name is Lillian Moore," she said. "And I knew Robert Henley, not as a community leader, not as a philanthropist, but as a man. A man with a past you may not know." The air grew tense, the chatter fading into silence. Lillian's eyes swept over the crowd, her gaze piercing yet sorrowful. "Robert Henley was indeed a man of great deeds," she began. "But before he became the man you all celebrate today, he was someone very different. Someone shaped by pain, by mistakes, and by sacrifices that none of you could imagine." She paused, letting her words sink in. The crowd was riveted, leaning forward as if drawn by an invisible force. "I met Robert 50 years ago," she continued, her voice soft but resolute. "Back then, he wasn't the man you see on that headstone. He was a troubled young man, angry at the world, reckless, and searching for something he couldn't name. And I was the one who tried to save him." Gasps rippled through the audience. Lillian's expression didn't waver, but there was a glint of sadness in her eyes. "I won't speak ill of the dead," she said, "but I also won't allow a sanitized version of his life to erase the truth. The truth that he was deeply flawed, like all of us. And the truth that the path he eventually took was paved with the sacrifices of others, sacrifices you've never been told about." The murmurs returned, louder this time, as people struggled to reconcile the image of the saintly Robert Henley with the troubled youth Lillian described. But Lillian wasn't finished. "I'll tell you about those sacrifices," she said. "Not to diminish his legacy, but to complete it. Because to truly honor him, you need to know the full story." She stepped down from the podium, her presence still commanding. The crowd parted instinctively as she walked toward the headstone, her movements deliberate and reverent. Placing a hand on the cold, polished granite, she whispered something inaudible before turning back to face the audience. "I'll share his story with you," she said, her voice filled with both resolve and an unspoken ache. "But it's not just his story. It's also mine." The crowd was silent, their earlier curiosity now replaced with a deep sense of anticipation. As Lillian prepared to reveal the truth, the weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. What secrets lay buried beneath the surface of Robert Henley's seemingly perfect life? And how did this enigmatic woman fit into the picture? The answers, Lillian promised, would change everything. The crowd stood frozen as Lillian moved away from the podium, her every step a deliberate act, as if she were retracing memories etched into the fabric of her soul. Her hand rested briefly on the edge of the casket, her fingers trembling as if reaching across the chasm of time. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a conversation meant only for the deceased. When she opened them again, they glistened with unshed tears, but her gaze was steady. Lillian turned to face the mourners once more, her presence commanding their attention without a single raised voice. The murmurs had subsided into an expectant hush, the crowd hanging on her every breath. She began to speak, her voice soft yet infused with the power of a truth that demanded to be told. "Robert Henley was not always the man you knew," she said, the words weighted with history. 50 years ago, he was a young man with fire in his veins, but that fire often burned those closest to him. I know because I was one of them." A ripple of unease moved through the mourners. This wasn't the story they had come expecting to hear. But no one interrupted. The sheer gravity of Lillian's demeanor compelled them to listen. "I was a teacher," she continued, her voice steady. "A young woman, full of hope and determination to make a difference. Robert was one of my students. He was bright, incredibly so, but also angry, at the world, at life, at himself. His family lived in a small, crumbling house at the edge of town, where every day was a battle against poverty. His father drank away what little they had, and his mother worked herself to the bone, trying to keep the family afloat. Robert carried that weight on his shoulders, but instead of seeking help, he lashed out. At the world. At me." Lillian's eyes flickered with a memory that seemed to replay vividly in her mind. "I remember the first time he spoke to me outside of class. It wasn't a polite conversation. He was furious because I had called him out for skipping school. He yelled, accusing me of not understanding his life, of not knowing what it was like to go hungry or to see your siblings cry because there wasn't enough food." She paused, her expression softening. "And he was right. I didn't understand. I couldn't. But I saw something in him, a brilliance buried beneath layers of pain. So, I made a decision that would change both of our lives. I chose not to give up on him." Her voice wavered for the first time, but she quickly steadied it. "I began tutoring him after school. At first, he resisted, calling me names, mocking my efforts. But slowly, that resistance gave way to curiosity, and then to trust. He had a sharp mind and a hunger for knowledge, though he tried to hide it behind a tough exterior. I helped him channel his anger into something constructive, and for a while, it seemed like he was turning a corner." Lillian's gaze dropped to the ground, her hands clasping each other tightly. But life doesn't always follow the paths we hope for. One night, Robert's father came home drunk and angry. There was a fight. Robert stepped in to protect his mother, and in the struggle, he struck his father. The man fell, hit his head, and never woke up. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lillian's voice grew quieter, but her words carried even greater weight. The authorities didn't care that it was self-defense. They saw a young black boy from a poor family and decided he was guilty before the trial even began. He was sentenced to 5 years in a juvenile detention center. She took a deep breath, the weight of the memory pressing down on her. I visited him every week. I brought him books, helped him study for his GED, and wrote letters to colleges on his behalf. I told him that his life wasn't over, that he could still become the man I knew he was meant to be. But those years changed him. He came out harder, angrier, and more determined never to let anyone see his vulnerability again. Her gaze swept over the crowd, her voice gaining strength. When Robert got out, he cut ties with everyone from his past, including me. He said he didn't want to be reminded of the boy he used to be. It broke my heart, but I respected his choice. For years, I didn't hear from him. I only knew that he had moved to another town, started a new life, and somehow managed to get into college. Lillian's lips curved into a bittersweet smile. Then, one day, out of the blue, I received a letter. It was from Robert. He told me he had graduated, that he was working for a nonprofit, and that he had finally found a way to channel his pain into helping others. He thanked me for believing in him when no one else did. He said I had saved his life. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. That was the last time I heard from him directly. Over the years, I followed his work from a distance, proud of the man he had become. But I also knew the sacrifices it had taken to get there. He had to bury his past, his mistakes, his pain, and the people who had stood by him during his darkest hours. He built his new life on the foundation of those sacrifices, and while I don't blame him for it, I think it's important for you all to know that the man you celebrate today was not perfect. He was human. Lillian's voice softened, a note of pleading entering her tone. I'm not here to diminish his legacy. Robert Henley was a good man, a great man. But he was also a flawed man, a man who made mistakes, who hurt people, who carried burdens that none of you could see. To honor him fully, you must honor all of him, the good and the bad, the light and the shadows. She stepped back, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her words had finally caught up with her. The crowd was silent, their expressions ranging from shock to introspection. No one seemed to know what to say or do. Then, a young woman stepped forward. She was clutching a photograph of Robert, her hands trembling. My name is Sarah, she said, her voice shaky. I was one of the kids he mentored at the youth center. He used to tell us that it's okay to make mistakes, that what matters is how you move forward. I always wondered why he seemed to understand that so deeply. Now I know. Her words seemed to unlock something in the crowd. One by one, people began to share their stories, not just of Robert's kindness, but of their own struggles, their own mistakes, their own sacrifices. The funeral, which had begun as a celebration of one man's life, transformed into a collective acknowledgement of humanity's shared imperfections. Lillian watched in silence, her heart heavy but full. As the crowd dispersed, many stopped to thank her, their eyes brimming with newfound understanding. She nodded politely, her mind elsewhere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cemetery in shades of amber and crimson, Lillian stood alone by Robert's grave. She placed a single white rose on the casket, her fingers lingering on the petals. Rest well, Robert, she whispered. You've earned it. And with that, she walked away, leaving behind a legacy not just of one man, but of the power of redemption, sacrifice, and truth. As Lillian walked away from the grave, the weight of the past felt lighter, but the memories lingered like the evening mist settling over the cemetery. She had shared her truth, but the story was far from over. Each step away from the headstone felt like a step into the abyss of memories that had once shaped her life and Robert's. Her hand gripped the small clutch at her side, and she could feel the edges of an old photograph within, a picture that had survived the decades, just like her emotions. That night, as the moonlight filtered through the curtains of her modest apartment, Lillian sat by her desk. Her silver hair shimmered under the soft glow of the table lamp. She pulled out the photograph, her fingers tracing the faces captured within it. It was an image of her younger self, standing next to Robert in his graduation gown. The memory of that day, so vivid and warm, brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. She had attended his graduation, despite not receiving an invitation. She had sat in the back row of the auditorium, her heart swelling with pride as his name was called. Robert had been surprised to see her there afterward, but he hadn't turned her away. Instead, they'd shared a brief moment, one where he thanked her for believing in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. It had been the last time she'd seen him in person before he disappeared into the life he rebuilt. The knock on her door startled her from her reverie. She wasn't expecting anyone. Rising slowly, she moved to the door, her steps cautious. When she opened it, a young man stood on the other side. His features were vaguely familiar, high cheekbones, warm brown eyes, and an earnest expression that reminded her of someone she hadn't expected to see reflected in another face. "Miss Moore?" the young man asked hesitantly. "Yes," she replied, her voice tentative. "Who are you?" "My name is Elijah," he said, offering a nervous smile. "I'm Robert Henley's son." The words took a moment to register. Lillian's breath caught, her grip tightening on the doorframe. "His son?" she echoed, disbelief mingling with curiosity. "Robert never mentioned." "I know," Elijah interrupted gently. "He didn't tell a lot of people about me. But I know about you. He talked about you more than anyone else from his past." Lillian stepped aside, gesturing for Elijah to enter. He looked around the cozy apartment, taking in the neatly arranged bookshelves and the small table near the window where a pot of tea sat steaming. Lillian poured him a cup, her hand steady, despite the storm of emotions brewing inside her. "Why are you here?" she asked after they were both seated. "Why now?" Elijah looked down at his cup, his fingers fidgeting with the handle. "I've been trying to piece together my father's life," he admitted. "He never talked much about his past, but he left behind letters he wrote but never sent. A lot of them were addressed to you." Lillian's heart clenched. The thought of Robert writing to her all those years, only to keep the letters hidden, was almost too much to bear. "Why didn't he send them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he was afraid," Elijah said, meeting her gaze. "Afraid you'd see him as a failure. He wrote about how much he owed you, how much he admired you, but he also wrote about his regrets, about cutting you off, about not saying goodbye properly." Lillian leaned back in her chair, her mind swimming with thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to confront in years. "He was always afraid of being vulnerable," she murmured. "Even when he was a boy, he thought showing pain meant showing weakness." Elijah nodded. "I think that's why he worked so hard to help others. It was his way of making amends, not just to the world, but to himself." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words settling between them. Finally, Elijah reached into his bag and pulled out a bundle of letters, bound with a faded ribbon. "These are for you," he said, placing them on the table. "I think he wanted you to have them, even if he never had the courage to deliver them himself." Lillian stared at the letters, her fingers trembling as she reached for them. The first envelope bore her name in Robert's unmistakable handwriting, a little slanted and uneven, as though he'd written it in a hurry. She opened it carefully, unfolding the yellowed paper within. The words on the page hit her like a wave. "Dear Miss Moore. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. You were the first person to see something in me when no one else did. You gave me hope when I didn't deserve it. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that. And I'm sorry for walking away the way I did. I thought it would be easier, for you, for me, if I disappeared. But I've regretted it every day. You told me once that people are defined not by their mistakes, but by how they rise from them. I've tried to live by that, but it hasn't been easy. Sometimes, I feel like no matter how much good I do, it'll never erase the pain I caused. But then I think about you, about how you never gave up on me, and it pushes me to keep going. I hope you're proud of the man I've become, even if I don't deserve it. Thank you. For everything. Robert." Lillian's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. She clutched the letter to her chest, the ache in her heart mingling with a profound sense of gratitude. She had always wondered if Robert remembered her, if he carried any part of her with him through his life. Now, she knew. Elijah watched her silently, his own emotions evident in the tight set of his jaw and the sheen in his eyes. "There are more," he said softly. "And I think they'll help you understand just how much you meant to him." Over the next few hours, Lillian and Elijah read through the letters together. Each one painted a fuller picture of Robert, a man tormented by his past, driven by a desire to atone, and profoundly grateful for the woman who had seen his potential when no one else did. Some letters were raw and emotional, filled with confessions of doubt and fear. Others were lighter, recounting moments of joy and triumph in his work. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the apartment, Lillian felt a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. She looked at Elijah, who had fallen asleep in the chair across from her, and smiled. In him, she saw a part of Robert, a continuation of his legacy, flawed but full of potential. She stood and walked to the window, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like a gift, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always light to be found. For the first time in decades, Lillian felt at peace. And in that peace, she found a quiet resolve, to honor Robert's memory not just by cherishing the man he became, but by continuing to believe in the goodness of people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lillian watched the world awaken outside her window. The events of the past day had left her drained but also deeply introspective. The letters from Robert were still spread across her table, their words etched into her mind like sacred scripture. She had spent the entire night reading them, uncovering the layers of a man she thought she had known and finding parts of herself reflected in his journey. Elijah stirred in his chair, groaning softly as he blinked awake. His disheveled appearance reminded Lillian of Robert's younger days, determined but slightly lost. He rubbed his eyes, glancing at the letters on the table, and then at Lillian, who was still standing by the window. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. "No," Lillian replied, turning to face him. "I couldn't. There was too much to process. These letters, they're a treasure, Elijah. They're a window into his soul." Elijah nodded, sitting up straighter. "I thought you deserved to have them. He wrote them for you, even if he never sent them." Lillian walked over to the table, her fingers brushing over the worn paper. "Thank you for bringing them to me. But now I have a question for you." Elijah looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "What do you want to know about your father?" she asked gently. "Why did you come to me now, after his funeral? What are you looking for?" The young man hesitated, as if unsure how to articulate his thoughts. Finally, he said, "I want to understand who he really was. Not the man everyone else saw, the philanthropist, the community leader, but the man underneath all of that. The man who carried those burdens. I feel like I only got to see part of him, and now that he's gone, I need to know the rest." Lillian regarded him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Your father was a complex man," she said finally. "He carried guilt like a shadow, but he also carried hope. He was both broken and whole, both lost and found. And to truly understand him, you have to be willing to confront both sides of that." Elijah nodded slowly. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Will you tell me the parts of his story that he couldn't?" For a moment, Lillian was silent, weighing the gravity of what he was asking. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "But if I'm going to tell you about Robert, you have to be ready to hear it all, the good, the bad, and the things that might be difficult to accept." "I'm ready," Elijah said firmly. Lillian gestured for him to follow her into the small living room, where she motioned for him to sit on the couch. She retrieved a box from the corner, its corners worn and its lid slightly askew. Setting it on the coffee table, she opened it to reveal an assortment of keepsakes, photographs, newspaper clippings, and small trinkets that seemed insignificant but carried deep meaning. "This box holds the pieces of Robert's life that I held on to," she said. "When he walked away, I kept these as a reminder of the boy I knew and the man I hoped he would become." She picked up a photograph, handing it to Elijah. It was a picture of Robert as a teenager, his face youthful but defiant, his eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to challenge the world. "This was taken the day he won the science fair," Lillian said with a faint smile. "He built a model of a wind turbine out of scrap materials. It wasn't the most polished entry, but it worked." The judges were so impressed by his ingenuity that they awarded him first place. Elijah studied the photo, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "He never mentioned this." "There's a lot he didn't mention," Lillian said. "Robert was proud of his accomplishments, but he was also ashamed of where he came from. He didn't want anyone to see the cracks in the foundation." She reached into the box again, pulling out a folded newspaper. The headline read, "Local Youth Wins Scholarship to Prestigious University." This was his turning point, she said. He had worked so hard to get that scholarship, and when he finally did, it felt like a victory against all the odds stacked against him. But it also meant leaving behind everything he knew, his family, his friends, and me. Elijah frowned. "Did he ever talk to you about why he left?" Lillian shook her head. "Not directly. But I think he felt that cutting ties was the only way to move forward. He wanted a clean slate, and he thought that meant letting go of the people who reminded him of his past." Elijah leaned back, his expression pensive. "It sounds like he was running from something." "He was," Lillian said softly. "But he was also running toward something. He wanted to prove that he could be more than his circumstances, more than his mistakes. And in doing so, he became a beacon for others who were struggling." She picked up a small keychain from the box, its metal tarnished with age. "This was the first thing he ever gave me," she said. "He found it in a thrift shop and bought it with the little money he had. He told me it was a thank you gift for helping him pass his exams. It's not worth much, but it meant the world to me because it showed me that he cared, even when he didn't know how to say it." Elijah stared at the keychain, his eyes glistening. "He really did care, didn't he?" "More than you'll ever know," Lillian said. "He just didn't always know how to show it." The hours passed as Lillian shared story after story, each one adding another layer to the portrait of Robert Henley. She told Elijah about the time Robert stood up to a bully who was harassing a younger student, about the nights he spent studying by candlelight because the electricity had been cut off, and about the way his eyes lit up whenever he talked about his dreams of making a difference. By the time Lillian finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows. Elijah sat silently, his head bowed as he absorbed everything he had learned. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "For keeping his memory alive. For believing in him when no one else did." Lillian reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "He believed in you, too," she said. "He may not have said it often, but he was proud of you. You were his greatest achievement." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening as he fought back tears. "I just wish I had more time with him. To ask him these things myself. To tell him how much I admired him." "He knew," Lillian said gently. "Even if it wasn't said out loud, he knew." As Elijah rose to leave, Lillian handed him the box of keepsakes. "Take this," she said. "It's yours now. These are the pieces of your father's story, and they belong with you." Elijah hesitated, then accepted the box with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "For everything." Lillian watched him leave, her heart heavy but full. She had spent decades carrying the weight of Robert's memory, and now, she had passed it on to the person who needed it most. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, knowing that Robert's story would live on, not as a sanitized version of perfection, but as the true, raw, and beautiful journey of a man who had fought to rise above his past. As she closed the door, Lillian turned back to the table where Robert's letters still lay. She picked up the final one, opened it, and read the closing words aloud, her voice steady and full of quiet resolve. If you ever wonder whether you made a difference, know this, you did. You saved me. And for that, I will always be grateful. She folded the letter and placed it back on the table, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The days following Elijah's visit were quiet, yet the echoes of his questions and the shared memories of Robert lingered in Lillian's thoughts. She went about her routine, watering the plants on her windowsill, preparing simple meals, and reading in her favorite chair, but the weight of something unfinished hung in the air. She had shared so much with Elijah, but she knew there was one final piece of Robert's story that had yet to be unearthed, a piece that even Elijah might not have fully understood. One crisp morning, as the sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, Lillian decided to visit a place she hadn't been in years. She dressed in her warmest coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and retrieved a small leather journal from a drawer in her desk. The journal was old, its pages yellowed and its binding frayed, but it held the key to the last chapter of Robert's story. She hailed a taxi and directed the driver to a location that felt both distant and familiar. The car wound its way through the streets of the city, past bustling markets and quiet parks, before reaching a small, unassuming building tucked away in a forgotten corner of town. The sign above the door read Cypress Grove Community Center. The building looked much the same as it had decades ago, though the paint was peeling, and the garden out front was overgrown. This was the place where Robert had poured his heart and soul, where he had built his legacy. It was where he had spent countless hours mentoring young people, organizing food drives, and creating programs to help those in need. Lillian stepped inside, the familiar scent of old wood and faintly lingering paint welcoming her like an old friend. The interior was quiet now, the hum of activity from Robert's time replaced by an eerie stillness. She walked through the main hall, her footsteps echoing off the walls, until she reached a small office at the back. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, she found a woman sorting through papers. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, looking up with a polite but curious expression. "Yes," Lillian said, her voice steady. "I'm here to learn more about Robert Henley's work. I knew him a long time ago." The woman's face softened. "Robert Henley," she said, as if tasting the name. "He was a legend around here. Are you a relative?" "No," Lillian said, shaking her head. "I was his teacher. And his friend." The woman gestured for her to sit, and Lillian took a seat across from the cluttered desk. "It's amazing to meet someone who knew him personally," the woman said. "We've been working to preserve his legacy, but honestly, we don't have much beyond what he left behind. If you'd like, I can show you some of his work." "I'd appreciate that," Lillian said. The woman led her down a narrow hallway to a storage room filled with boxes. She pulled out a file labeled Henley Archives and handed it to Lillian. Inside were photos, documents, and handwritten notes, remnants of Robert's relentless dedication to his cause. Lillian sifted through them, her eyes lingering on a photograph of Robert standing in front of a group of children, his smile radiant and genuine. But what caught her attention most was a folded piece of paper tucked into the corner of the file. She carefully unfolded it, revealing a handwritten speech. The words leapt off the page, raw and vulnerable, as if Robert himself were speaking directly to her. "To the people I've helped, you are not just my inspiration, you are my redemption. My life has been a series of mistakes and lessons, and I have found my purpose in helping you avoid the same pitfalls. But I must confess that my work is not selfless. It is my way of making peace with a past I cannot change, of repaying the debts I owe to those who stood by me when I was lost." Lillian's throat tightened as she read. The speech was unfinished, the last sentence trailing off mid-thought. It was clear that Robert had never delivered it, but its message resonated deeply. "Do you mind if I take this with me?" Lillian asked, holding up the paper. "Of course," the woman said. "Anything that helps keep his story alive." Lillian thanked her and left the center, clutching the speech tightly. She didn't return home immediately. Instead, she found herself drawn to another destination, a small park where she and Robert had once met during his troubled teenage years. The park had changed over time, the benches were newer, and the trees had grown taller, but it still held the same quiet charm. She sat on a bench overlooking the pond, the folded speech resting in her lap. For a long time, she simply stared at the water, her thoughts swirling like the ripples on its surface. She thought of Robert's sacrifices, his resilience, and the immense weight he had carried in his efforts to make the world a better place. Pulling the leather journal from her bag, she opened it to a blank page and began to write. Her words flowed effortlessly, as if guided by an unseen hand. She wrote about the boy she had met all those years ago, the young man who had struggled to find his way, and the extraordinary person he had become. She wrote about his flaws, his fears, and his triumphs. She wrote about the legacy he had left behind, not just in the lives he had touched, but in the lessons he had taught her about the power of hope and redemption. When she finished, she closed the journal and sat back, a sense of calm washing over her. The journal wasn't just a tribute to Robert, it was a testament to the impact one person could have on another's life. It was a reminder that even the most broken among us have the potential to create something beautiful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lillian rose from the bench. She walked slowly back to her apartment, her steps lighter than they had been in years. That night, as she placed the journal on her desk beside Robert's letters, she felt a profound sense of closure. Robert Henley's story was no longer a series of fragmented memories and unfinished conversations. It was complete, woven together by the threads of those who had loved him, supported him, and believed in him. And though he was gone, his legacy lived on, in the community he had built, in the lives he had changed, and in the hearts of those who carried his memory. Lillian looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the stars that now dotted the night sky. Somewhere out there, she felt, Robert was watching over them, his spirit as unwavering as the man she had known and cherished. "Thank you, Robert," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet reverence. "For everything."